Hey guys, and welcome back to HeebeeJeebeezTV. My name is Ashley, and if you're new here, on this channel we like to talk about stuff like true crime, the paranormal, and unsolved mysteries. Now in today's case, we're going to talk about a very disturbing case, and it's also a very unfortunate case that could have been prevented, but sadly the system failed the victims and also the perpetrator multiple times over. So we're going to talk about the Vampire of Sacramento, also known as Richard Chase. Now, Richard was said to have had a very difficult childhood, and this is not justifying what he did. It's just me giving you a little bit of context as to what could have possibly led to these events, and for us to just understand a little bit more about him. So Richard was born on May 23rd, 1950 in Sacramento, California, but he barely had a chance at life. His life was filled with problems almost from the very beginning, starting with his mental health. From a very young age, he started showing signs of mental illness. When he was born, his parents were married and they stayed married for a while, but it was a very toxic relationship. It was said to have been filled with a lot of abuse, a lot of verbal, physical abuse, a lot of fighting. It just was not a good situation for anyone, especially a young boy that was already suffering with mental illness problems. Eventually, his parents did end up getting divorced, but that really didn't help Richard at all. His problems just kept getting worse and worse as he got older. And sadly, he was born during a time where mental illness was still seen as somewhat taboo. It was still misunderstood. People didn't fully understand what was actually going on. So he did not get the help that he needed. And his own father was said to have kind of just brushed off the fact that there was something wrong with Richard. So as he was growing up, Richard started showing some very disturbing warning signs. For example, he was wetting the bed, he was starting fires, and he was even hurting animals. Now, for reference, these three things are actually very important and are considered to be a warning sign that something worse is to come. They're actually known as the McDonald Triad, and they're known to be early warning signs of violent psychopathy or homicidality, a concept that was proposed by psychiatrist J.M. McDonald. And he breaks it down into three very clear components. The first one being bedwetting. Now, he said that if a child continuously wets the bed after the age of 5, it's a very clear sign that the child is suffering from some sort of high stress environment, a lot of anxiety, and that the child is usually very overwhelmed. These feelings then grow into a feeling of embarrassment, a lot of shame, and the child ends up often feeling like they're always getting into trouble. This then evolves into feeling of self-hatred, low confidence, no self-esteem, and a lot of pent-up aggression. The second one would be fire starting. Now, this is a manifestation of a lot of repressed anger, a lot of internal anger, and it's said to be one of the only ways a repressed child is able to gain some control by destroying things or setting things on fire. Now, the third point is animal cruelty, and this usually results in the child needing to take out their anger and frustration on something. This usually comes after the child has been deeply humiliated and feels like they have been very much let down and hurt by society. Now, here they're said to usually go for small defenseless animals because they're a much easier target. They're very vulnerable. And it's also said to be practiced for when they're ready to graduate to actual humans. So Richard continues to grow up and he's now becoming a teenager, but his issues are getting worse and worse to the point that his father just cannot take it anymore. And his father ends up kicking him out of the house. And this sets off a chain of events that completely sends Richard down a very deep, dark hole. He started dabbling in alcohol and illegal substances, which we all know mental illness and these things do not mix well together. So he ended up getting worse and worse. So much so that he started hallucinating and actually became a hypochondriac. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically someone that thinks that they are constantly sick or getting new illnesses and diseases. Being a hypochondriac led him to diagnose himself with some very odd things, including that he was an actual zombie because he thought that his heart had just stopped beating. And at one point, he thought he was so deficient in vitamin C that he figured that the best thing for him to do was to take an orange peel and literally just stick it on his head, and that his brain would absorb the nutrients that way. But that was far from it. One time, he felt like his cranial bones were actually starting to separate. He swore that he could feel his cranial bones shifting around almost like a puzzle, and this freaked him out. So he ended up shaving his head because he said he wanted to keep track of their movements. Then he also tried injecting himself with some rabbit's blood, but obviously that did not work and ended up making him very, very sick. But that still wasn't it. He had actually also become very, very paranoid to the point where he thought that the Nazis, the FBI, and UFOs were all coming after him, and that they had a secret weapon hidden in his apartment that seemed to be very, very innocent, but it actually wasn't. And he thought that the secret weapon happened to be his soap dish. All of this odd behavior was alarming the people around him, and it finally did catch up with him because he was institutionalized in 1975 when he was only 25 years old, and that's where he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. So once he was at the hospital, he developed quite the reputation for himself. Patients and staff at the hospital started calling him Dracula because he had a very strange and intense obsession with blood. Patients and medical staff at the hospital reported seeing him kill a few birds because he thought that his own blood was turning into powder. So he thought that the only solution at this point was to kill animals and drink their blood. When he couldn't get his hands on some birds, he would steal some syringes when no one was looking. And the hospital had some therapy dogs coming in and out quite often. So he would take those syringes and steal some blood from dogs whenever he could. This odd behavior just continued at the hospital for the duration of his stay, which ended up being about a year. But he was on some medicine, so doctors thought that he was getting a little bit better to the point where they deemed that he was no longer a danger to society. So in 1976, he was released. It was determined that when he was released that he needed to be released into the care of his mother, but for unknown reasons, she ended up helping him wean off of his medication, which proved to be a very big mistake because this just made Richard so much more sick than he already was. There was also another big problem. You see, although he was released into his mother's care, there was nothing legally forcing him to live with his mother. And so he was essentially free to go wherever he wanted, and that's exactly what happened. Soon enough, he ended up moving out of his mother's house because he was convinced that she was trying to poison him. So she ended up helping him find an apartment, and it's also reported that she actually ended up paying his rent. So he goes off and he moves into this new apartment with people that Richard referred to as friends. But if you were to ask these people, they wouldn't say the same thing about Richard. It was more of a situation where they needed a roommate because they needed some help to cover the rest of the rent. However, it did not take very long for these roommates of Richard's to notice his very odd behavior. When he was living with these guys, he was said to walk around naked all the time. Even when company was in the house, he would use a lot of illegal substances. He was drinking all the time. He smelled really bad, and it was making everyone around him extremely uncomfortable. So his roommates, they tried talking to him. They tried telling him to, change his behavior, but Richard did not react to any of this. He just simply didn't care. And so they escalated this a little bit and told him that he needed to leave, but Richard was adamant he was not going anywhere. So taking the path of least resistance, his roommates just essentially decided to abandon the apartment and they all moved out, leaving Richard to live by himself. Being alone in this apartment was not a good thing for Richard. He was alone with his own thoughts. He could hear the voices telling him to do very terrible things, and he started getting impulses for blood again. this time, instead of just killing animals for their blood, he decided to take a step further. Not only would he drink the blood of these small animals, but he would also take their organs and put them into a blender with some Coca-Cola or pop and then blend them together to make some sort of smoothie, because he believed that by drinking this concoction, it would prevent his heart from shrinking and essentially dying. Then in August of 1977, police found him near Lake Tahoe in Nevada, and he was said to have been completely covered in blood, and he was also carrying a bucket that had blood in it and what looked like to be organs. So police stop him because this is obviously very alarming to see. You know, you see a naked man walking around covered in blood, you think he's probably committed a very heinous crime. So when police stop him, they question him, and he ends up telling them that it's just cow's blood, and he was telling the truth. It ended up being cow's blood, and the organs inside the bucket did belong to a cow. So there was no crime that had been committed, so police essentially had to let him go. Then things took a very dark turn during Christmas of 1977. So because Richard was exhibiting some very problematic behavior, his mother had decided not to invite him over for the Christmas holidays that year, and so he had spent Christmas alone and spent the next few days kind of just brewing by himself with anger inside of his apartment. And on December 29th of 1977, he finally decided to act out. That same day, a man named Ambrose Griffin was in his driveway, and he was with his wife. They had just gotten home from grocery shopping, so they were unloading their car when Richard slowly drove by their street and just shot Ambrose in the chest multiple times, essentially killing him on the spot. And this event would spark the beginning of his insane killing spree. A little under a month later, on January 23rd, 1978, Richard chose his next victim, who happened to be a woman named Teresa Wallen, and she was also 3 months pregnant at the time. Unfortunately, when she was home, she had made the mistake of leaving her door unlocked, which made this very easy for Richard to gain access into her home. And he actually ended up using this as an excuse later on when he was caught and he was asked about how he chose his victims. He said that whenever someone would leave their door unlocked, he would take it as an invitation to come on in and do whatever he wanted. So he breaks into Teresa's home, and using the same gun he used to kill Ambrose, he does the same thing to Teresa and shoots her 3 times, but he wasn't quite done with Teresa. He then takes a butcher knife and starts stabbing her in the abdomen and in the chest, and then proceeds to disembowel her by pulling out her organs. And then he starts performing necrophilia on her body. And if that wasn't enough, he then starts drinking her blood, and it was said that he used a yogurt cup because it was later found at the crime scene with a mouth print around the rim of the yogurt cup. And from here, things just got more and more gruesome. Just 4 days later, Richard would strike again, and this time it would be on a woman named Evelyn Miroth and her family. Her door also happened to be unlocked, and inside was Evelyn with her 6-year-old son Jason, her 2-year-old nephew David, and a friend of hers named Dan. So Richard makes his way into Evelyn's home and straight away just starts shooting everyone in the head. He ended up shooting Evelyn, Dan, and her son Jason all in the head. But that wasn't enough for Richard. He also ended up cannibalizing and performing necrophilia on Evelyn's body, removing her organs, and he even removed one of her eyeballs. In the middle of all this, a neighbor had actually come by and ended up knocking on the door because Jason had missed a play date with their kids. So they go and they knock on the door, and this ends up scaring Richard so much so that he grabs the keys and takes Evelyn's car and drives off. The neighbor, obviously alarmed to see some stranger just get into Evelyn's car and drive off, runs back home and calls 911. When police arrived, they discovered a very gruesome scene. Evelyn, Dan, and her son Jason were all found dead in the apartment with gunshot wounds to their heads, but the little baby, her nephew David, was missing. Sadly, a few months later, his little body would be found behind a church inside of a box, and the worst part of it all was that his head was missing. Although Richard had managed to escape the crime scene without getting caught, he did leave some evidence behind that would lead to his arrest. He ended up leaving very clear handprints and footprints in Evelyn's blood. So police start questioning neighbors of Evelyn, and they receive some startling information. One neighbor said they saw a very strange man kind of sneaking around Evelyn's home around 11 p.m. He described him as being super skinny, he looked very disheveled, and he also said he was wearing an orange parka. Police then took this information and created a composite sketch, which they ended up releasing to the media and to the public, and thankfully it ended up working pretty quickly. The day after the murders, a woman named Nancy ended up coming forward, and she had a very interesting story to tell. She said that on the day Teresa was murdered, she was actually out shopping. And when she had finished, she was out in the parking lot heading towards her car when she was approached by a strange man wearing an orange parka. She described him as being extremely skinny. He looked very disheveled as well. He looked dirty. He smelled really bad. And before she could really understand what was happening, he started asking her some very strange questions that no one would really know to ask her unless they knew her. She said that this man started asking her about her high school boyfriend, and to her surprise, she ends up asking him, "Well, how do you know this?" And he replies, "Don't you recognize me?" That's when he tells her that his name is Rick Chase and that they had actually gone to high school together. When she told police this story, she said that she was completely freaked out about this because she did not recognize Richard from when they had gone to high school together. She said that when he was in high school, he looked very well put together. He was clean. He just seemed like a very shy, studious boy. And this person that had approached her in the parking lot was a complete 180 of the kid that she used to know. She also said that she noticed red stains on his hands, and she thought that it could have potentially been blood. And this freaked her out even more. So she kind of just hopped into her car and got out of there as quickly as she could. Unfortunately, she didn't think to report this because she didn't think anything of it. She probably thought that he was just having a hard time. She didn't want to get involved, and she didn't think anything of it again up until she heard about the murders. So the manhunt for Richard began, and it didn't take very long for police to find him. It ended up leading them to his apartment, and when they arrived and were able to get in there, they described a scene something out of a horror movie. Inside of his apartment, it was said that all of the walls, all of the furniture, the ceilings, basically everything was drenched in blood. And when they looked inside the fridge, they apparently found human brains in there, all of his cooking utensils, all his pots and pans, his spatulas, dinnerware, his dishware. It was all covered in blood as well. Police also found something very interesting. It was a calendar, and it had a few dates marked with the word today. And they quickly noticed a pattern. The days that were marked with the word today were the days that he had killed his previous victims. But the startling piece of information here is that Richard had 44 more dates into the future that were also marked with the word today, meaning that he was planning on killing at least 44 more people. So needless to say, Richard was arrested, and his trial began on January 2nd of 1979. And it ended up lasting quite a bit. It lasted about 5 months, and prosecutors were fighting really, really hard for the death sentence. His lawyers rejected this idea. They were fighting really hard to get him declared as insane, or at least not competent to stand trial, that he couldn't be found guilty for these crimes because there was actually something wrong with him. Unfortunately for them, the jury did not think so, and they ended up agreeing with the prosecutors, and they found him guilty of all of these murders and sentenced him to death by gas chamber. But Richard would actually never make it to the gas chamber. You see, so when he was found guilty and he was sentenced and he went to jail, a lot of the inmates were already talking about what he had done and who he was. There was a lot of rumors going around the prison. And knowing the gruesome murders that he had done and what he had done to the bodies afterwards ended up scaring a lot of the prisoners. Essentially, they were all terrified that they would become Richard's next victim. So what they all decided to start doing was that they started talking to Richard and trying to convince him to take his own life instead of waiting for the gas chamber. And surprisingly, it ended up working. Richard had decided to start hoarding his medication. I'm not sure how he was able to get away with it because from what I understand, they check if you need to take medication in prison, they make sure that you actually do take it. But Richard had started hoarding this medication and stockpiling up until he was able to get to a certain dosage that would almost guarantee an overdose. And on December 26, 1980, he was found dead inside his prison cell. And that's the end of the Vampire of Sacramento. Let me know what you guys think of this story. Have you ever heard of it before? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Again, if you also have any other case suggestions, whether they're paranormal or true crime, leave them in the comments below. I would love to take a look. But that does it for me in this week's video. Thanks so much for joining me, guys, and I will see you in the next one.